In the spring of 2019, thoroughbred horse racing came under harsh scrutiny after 23 racehorses died at Santa Anita Park, a racetrack in Los Angeles, in only a 6-month period. The deaths, which were due to racing and training injuries, induced criticism that the drugs used by trainers to enable the horses to run extraordinarily fast and conceal pain also masked the warning signs of potentially catastrophic injuries. Animal rights activists who portrayed horse racing as cruel immediately called for an overhaul of the sport. This is just one of the many incidents that have been recently reported against the infringing of animal rights. Good afternoon, everyone. In this presentation, I will be addressing three principal questions by making use of an approach of defending animal rights. First, is it morally correct to breed or use animals to harvest their organs for human benefit, that is, xenotransplantation? Second, should we establish any limit to the way we use animals for human benefit? And third, should non-human animals have the same moral status as human animals? Before we begin addressing the questions, let us go with some basic definitions. How can you define rights? Or in particular, how can you define animal rights? According to the Merriam-Webster definition, a right is something in accordance with what is just, good, or proper. It is a justified claim, entitlement, or assertion of what a rights holder is due. The Britannica Encyclopedia defines animal rights as moral or legal entitlements attributed to non-human animals, usually because of the complexity of their cognitive, emotional, and social lives, or their capacity to experience physical or emotional pain or pleasure. So before we begin addressing the question, is xenotransplantation morally wrong or morally right? What is xenotransplantation? According to Money and Matthew, the simple definition of xenotransplantation is it is the use of animal cells and tissues in the treatment of man. In my opinion, even if one accepts in principle the use of animals in medicine and in medical research, their use in xenotransplantation may raise several problems. However, not everyone may agree with this point of view. For example, consequentialists may view the suffering and death of an animal as acceptable for the betterment of a human patient, as they would judge the morality of an action primarily by its end result. They would argue that potential benefits and improvements in human welfare that arise from xenotransplantation may justify the loss of animal life, as they cannot be able to equate animal life with that of human life. Consequentialists may even think that conducting procedures to xenotransplantation to save human lives can justify a minimal amount of suffering to animals. But then the real question is, who is to judge what is minimal in terms of pain imparted to animals during experimental procedures, and who can regulate this? Nowadays, it is widely recognized that many animals, mainly the mammals that are used for xenografts, are susceptible to pain and suffering. Keeping this in mind, it's important to understand that there is no logical reason to distinguish morally the pain and suffering felt by animals from that felt by human beings. Suffering is suffering wherever and to whoever it is caused. It would be wrong to weigh animal suffering less heavily than human suffering, just as it would be wrong to weigh the suffering of one human being less heavily than another. I would like to apply the principle of utilitarianism to better support my ideas opposing xenotransplantation. Australian philosopher and bioethics professor at Princeton University and one of the founders of the modern animal rights movement, namely Peter Singer, used a special approach to utilitarianism. He demanded that, when comparable interests are involved, those of humans and those of animals must be given equal weight. Singer's proposal for putting animals on an equal moral footing to that of human beings of course did not mean that he believed animals should have, for example, the right to vote or own property. What he meant was humans should have what he called an equal consideration of interest towards animals, meaning essentially that if an animal feels pain, the pain matters as much as it does when a human feels pain. Therefore, when judging the acceptability of the use of animals for xenotransplantation or for any other medical purpose, it can be firmly stated that the pain and suffering caused to the animals cannot be justified by the potential benefits to human beings. Now let me move on to address the next two questions. Should we establish any limit to the way we use animals for human benefit, and whether non-human animals should have the same moral status as human animals? The real question here is not whether there are differences between humans and animals, because clearly there are. The question is, are these differences morally significant? There is no compelling reason for us to exploit animals for their fur, meat, bodily fluids, and entertainment value, as such pleasures that humans derive are just like, for example, from eating meat, are trivial satisfactions that in no way can justify the confinement, suffering, torture, and violent death of billions of animals. So this statement may seem questionable, like why would I establish a limit to the way I use animals for my own benefit? That is where we look at an interesting concept called speciesism. Speciesism can be defined as discrimination against non-human animals just because of their species. So basically, a speciesist is someone who favors the interests of humans over non-human animals, such that humans always count more by sheer virtue of their species membership as Homo sapiens. According to an article titled "All Animals Are Equal" by Peter Singer, experimenting on animals and eating their flesh are perhaps the two major forms of speciesism in our society. He observes that to give preference to the life of a being simply because that being is a member of our own species would put us in the same position as racists who give preference to those who are members of their own race. Let us broaden our perspective about the aspect of speciesism by considering the following scenario. Imagine that you have come across a burning building. From inside, you hear the howls of a dog and the screams of a human infant. Flames are licking at your heels and you run into the building to realize that you only have enough time to save one or the other. Which one would you choose, the dog or the child? I know that's a tough question, and there might not be an actual solution to this. However, according to Francione in his article titled "Animal Rights Theory and Utilitarianism," the apt utilitarian Singer will respond to this problem by arguing that if an individual would choose a child over the dog, then he or she would have failed to take the interests of animals seriously and to weigh any adverse effect on those interests from human actions as part of the consequences of those actions because of a species bias or speciesism that results in a systematic devaluation of animal interests. In other words, it would be morally wrong to choose the life of the child over the dog in this scenario, because it would mean that if we appeal only to language and reason to deny animal rights, then on the same grounds we must also deny rights to large categories of human beings. And what categories exactly am I talking about? For someone who supports saving the child and leaving the dog in the burning home, he or she would equally be claiming that fetuses, infants, comatose patients, some elderly people, and the severely retarded all would have no complex form of consciousness and so would have no claim to rights. Is this morally correct? We can use our sense of logic and reason to easily analyze the wrongness of this judgment. An average adult human, an adult human who is severely mentally challenged, and even a mouse, all have an equal interest in continuing to live. In other words, they all have the same interest in continuing to have experiences throughout their senses and thoughts. In our textbook, Doing Ethics, Moral Reasoning and Contemporary Issues, Vaughan states that the term animal rights is synonymous with the term moral status. Keeping that in mind, if we try to address whether non-human animals have the same moral status as human animals, philosophers who argue against animal rights would bring up certain things, such as if having rights means assuming responsibility, then animals shouldn't have rights because they cannot be held morally responsible for what they do. then they would say that humans can perceive what's good and evil while animals cannot, and they cannot perceive what's right and wrong. Therefore, they shouldn't be given rights. Similarly, with rights comes duty, and animals have no sense of duty or legal obligations. And lastly, animals were created for man to use. Philosophers like Mary Ann Warren, for example, would argue that animals do indeed have some moral rights, but there are reasons for thinking that these rights are weaker or less demanding than the rights of humans. She does agree that both humans and animals do have the right to life, but believes that this right is generally weaker for animals than for humans. So, in other words, they argue that the moral status of animals is lower than the moral status of humans. However, I disagree with this and goes with the notion put forward by American philosopher and non-consequentialist named Tom Regans in his 1980 book titled The Case for Animal Rights. He says that if animals share with human beings some or all of those characteristics that would lead us to assert they have certain rights, then those rights should be ascribed to the animals as well. The ascription of rights, whether to human beings or animals, rests on the principle that the lives of individuals have an inherent value. We could easily apply Kant's second categorical imperative to this in order to justify that such individuals should be treated as ends in themselves rather than merely as means to the happiness or well-being of others. I would like to provide a conclusion to my ideas about the third question I addressed by quoting the words that the British Union for the Abolition of Vivisection, that is now known as the Cruelty Free International, provided in the written submission to the Nuffield Council on Bioethics in the UK by placing strong emphasis on Kant's second categorical imperatives. They stated that the use of healthy animals as a source of spare parts for humans represents a fundamental denial of the inherent value of those animals' lives. To conclude, I would like to present whatever we have learned in the form of an argument. Premise 1. If a being is the subject of a life, then it can be said to have inherent value. My second premise is all beings with inherent value are equally valuable and entitled to the same rights. Thirdly, their inherent value doesn't depend on how useful they are to the world, and doesn't diminish if they are a burden to others. In conclusion, non-human animals have rights in just the same way, for the same reasons, and to the same extent that human beings have rights. With that, I come to an end of my presentation. Thank you.